What's today? The 15th of April, 2025, and we're completing an oral history interview for the Understanding Social Work Leadership in Canada project. So thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
I'm just going to do a quick reconsent, which is part of the requirements for REB.
Mm-hmm.
So we already chatted about the fact that we have two recording methods today. One is the voice recorder and the other one is the video recorder. And so we will use the voice recorder to produce transcripts. We'll do three things with the transcripts. The first is create the transcripts from the voice recording, and we will fidelity check them and then provide you with a copy to make sure that you're comfortable with everything that you said, and if there's anything that requires clarification or correction, we'll take care of that with you. Alternatively, if you want to have some or all of the interview re-recorded because you're not happy with it, we're happy to make that possible, but we may have to do it by Zoom. The second thing that we'll do with the voice recording transcripts is that we will use them to caption the video recording so that it's AODA compliant, and we can use it for teaching and learning. And then the third thing that we will do is we will use it for data analysis, and we're going to do some analysis on the themes in all of the interviews to see if we can develop a bit of a model for social work leadership in Canada.
Excellent.
Because we don't have very much scholarship in that area. Then we have the video recording. So the video recording will be made public via the project YouTube channel so that it's easily accessible to folks all over the place. We will also keep a copy at the university library at McMaster University in our digital repository so that folks can view it at the university, but also preservation in terms of the format of it. And then finally, we will offer a copy of the complete set to Library and Archives Canada as a companion to the original project.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So do you consent to be video recorded today?
I do.
And to be audio recorded?
I do.
And for the materials to be used as I suggested once you have final consent.
Perfect, yes.
Excellent. Okay, well thank you very much for being here today, as I said already. I usually start by asking people if they can tell me a little bit about their early lives and their growing up, and whether there was something or anything in your early life that maybe led you to choose social work as your career.
So I grew up in rural Nova Scotia in a small community called Bass River. Most people wouldn't know that from the map, but if you like Dominion chairs and good quality chairs, that was the place to be. So that's where I grew up. I would say probably I might have started to become a little bit of a social justice warrior at a very young age for some reason. I think a lot of contributing things, but I think when I really started to notice my energy around this type of work was probably in junior high. And I remember, I think when I look back to talk about what led me here, it was really history. And I went on to do my undergrad in sociology and history, did a double major because I thought they blended very well together. I was very intrigued by historical monumental events and kind of what happened to people. So that started, I think, really the intrigue. And then my mother started to notice this, and I will always credit her. She took me to visit because I suddenly discovered about social workers. And so she took me to visit a local social worker who talked to me a little bit about what social workers were and do. And I always joke, I've stayed friends with this person who's become a really great mentor in my life, but her husband looked across the table at me and said, "You have social work eyes." So I often tease him and say, like, why didn't you say I had the eyes of somebody else? But here we are. So I think that's probably where all of this started.
Okay, wow, fantastic. That's wonderful. You had a very insightful mother.
I did. I do.
Yeah. So what happened? You did a sociology degree. How did you end up transitioning into social work?
So I did my undergraduate degree at Mount Saint Vincent, which I was really excited about, kind of the gender-based look at the work around sociology and history. I did a lot on Canadian history, became more and more intrigued, but not just Canadian history. I was looking at some global. So that really kind of piqued my interest and kind of fanned me into understanding that this felt like the career path. But I actually didn't go back to do a social work degree probably for another 10 years.
Wow.
So that was an interesting, it's funny how life kind of changes and pivots. So I had my children after that time of doing my undergrad, and then over time my marriage dissolved, and I ended up moving back into this region, the Truro region, where I had started working at nonprofits.
Okay.
So I actually got a job with United Way, which was really exciting. And again, I credit these amazing people that came along as mentors in my life. So the the person who looked after the United Way, she saw something in me. She said, definitely a passion. So she was able to kind of get me in touch, and I did a lot of work with all of the nonprofits. And I went on to do all kinds of contract work with family resource, sexuality resource centers, community gardening programs, boys and girls clubs. So I had this really interesting 10 years of doing all kinds of great, neat work in the nonprofit sector, which really gave me a lot of firsthand information and a deeper understanding of people and working with people in community groups. Very passionate about community. But I will be really honest, the thing that really propelled me to go do my social work degree was a cancer diagnosis.
Okay, wow.
So I was diagnosed with cancer in my early 30s. And at the same time, my grandma was actually going through her end of life process. And so I ended up taking a volunteer palliative care program, and I was really intrigued with all of that. So by the time my cancer diagnosis happened during that time, I became very interested in how do families, like seeking support for my children and really looking at the dynamics of health, and then how do we actually roll that out to actually help people. So I jokingly talk about I had the wrong kind of cancer because I couldn't get a support group. And again, when you look at the rural impacts, gender-based impacts, all of this became really interesting to me. So when I got the clear bill of health, I decided it's time to get on with life. This is what you want it to do. Let's go do it. So I applied and I got into a condensed kind of, I think one of their last ones at St. Thomas University. So I went back and did my undergrad, my BSW at that time. So that was exciting.
Wow.
Yep.
So do you remember any of the folks who were at St. Thomas at that time? Was there a particular focus or something that was happening at the school during your time there?
So I was really intentional that I wanted to go to St. Thomas. I really liked it. It was an 18-month program because I had 2 children in tow. And I also really loved the fact that they incorporated spirituality and social work. So that intrigued me, especially when I was looking at end-of-life issues. But I jokingly will say, I pulled up with my U-Haul, my 2 children, and I said, I really want to do kind of death, dying, and grief social work. What do you have? And they immediately said, nothing. And I said, you don't know what this has been like. We need to make this happen.
Wow.
And I was deeply and still deeply credit the fact that I had faculty that stood up to actually do independent study with me. And I felt like I left with my BSW with the things that I was going there seeking. So that was really helpful. We did independent studies. I will always credit the intentional, amazing work I did with Brian Willett, who was an incredible mentor at the time. So that's kind of what happened.
Super. Placements while you were there?
Yeah, placement. So Brian always had this saying, so it was always interesting. And I think, again, from thinking about the people that kind of helped you get here, when Brian and I did the independent study, I had no idea that about 1.5 years later, he would suddenly die. Wow. And so we had these very intimate conversations about death and dying. And you didn't realize at the time that that was part of his legacy, as well as talking about he didn't know. Neither one of us did. So,
wow, that's really,
yeah, truly was.
Wow.
Yeah. But he always used to say to me, you need to trust in the process. And I think about our spirituality class, because I had a couple of different classes with him. And even today, I'll hear the songs come on that we listen to in class and kind of deconstruct it. And I think there's Brian reminding me to continue to trust in the process, which frustrated me at the time. So you asked about placement. I said, I need a placement in a hospice palliative care. This is what I want to do. But it was a little challenging because my cancer came back. I had an hour drive anywhere, so I ended up doing a placement in mental health. I was a little frustrated because that's not where I wanted to go. He said to me, sometimes we do need to do these things, and I was so glad. So I had a beautiful mentor, incredible person, taught me so much. So I worked with the seniors team as my placement, and my mentor, Maria, was phenomenal. Just exactly the kind of placement I needed. So I did that in Fredericton with the seniors mental health clinic. So I, started to do some group work with seniors, and, I would be looking at some of the curriculum, the psychoeducational, and I'm like, there's no grief in here. And people saying, well, we don't do that. And so learning very quickly how to advocate and how do we start to kind of morph and change, meeting people where they're at. So yeah, that was a really great experience, and laid a really great foundation for me that, again, I think social work is not all about going in one complete direction and being rigid with that. So it's exactly what I needed.
Fantastic. So then what happened?
After I graduated, and health definitely improved, which was exciting, I stayed on to work with the mental health team, but I transitioned into the adult team because there was an opening. And so I stayed in Fredericton and worked with the adult mental health. Loved doing that out in the community. I really loved the way that we worked there, that I was very engaged in community. So stayed there. It was a short-term position. And then at the same time, probably about 6 months, a year later, I got a call from the federal government because I had applied way back when, and I got a job back here at Nova Institution. So I worked in the federal prison here, institution. So I came back to work with women who were incarcerated at a federal level, and that opened up new possibilities and understanding of that world. And mental health, I worked as part of the mental health team. Now, the first term I did, I was considered a behavioral counselor.
Okay.
And then when that term ended, I actually became their first social worker on the team.
Wow.
So that was an interesting time as well.
Anything else you'd like to say about working at Nova?
Yes. It's difficult to be the first. And again, I wasn't the first social worker in a federal institution, but for this one, as a position on the mental health team, that was tough. There was not a lot of recognition or understanding about what social workers were all about. And so I had to do a lot of advocacy around helping them understand. I think about some of the advocate groups that came in, and I would welcome them with open arms. We're all part of the same thing, helping to do the discharge planning. So, but that's not always the reception that they had.
Okay.
So there were tensions that I wasn't quite as aware. So I was pretty naive at the time. But a lot of great learning about women, working alongside them, seeing the barriers. Again, and I use that broadly around culture, healthcare, poverty issues, socioeconomic. I remember at one time helping to advocate to get report cards and school pictures sent from child protection agencies to advocate that they're still mom. I found that oftentimes I was being called into situations around kind of extensive grief, trauma. So yeah, it was very powerful. It was a very powerful time. I had opportunity to learn more, like travel, get more mental health courses under my belt, learned more about DBT. But I remember at the time kind of pushing back, saying like, I'm not a social worker that practices from one theory. And that was a really good learning for me as well. And just a rich opportunity to work with First Nations. I would often attend sweats on site.
Thank you. And so where did you move to after you were at Nova?
So those were term positions. A position opened up as the first executive director for a nonprofit hospice in the province. So I applied and I was successful in that. So I kind of steered back into nonprofit and kind of helped foundationally to get this off the ground. And that was exciting. So
for sure. So just before we move on to the discussing hospice, about how long were you at Nova, just so we have a sense of like what the term time was?
there was 2 different terms. I would say probably about a year and a half, 2 years.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. And then went on. I mean, really, this whole understanding of death, dying, and grief was really important to me. So moving into the hospice realm it felt like a natural step for me.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was it like, again, kind of trailblazing? It sounds like first hospice, first ED. Yeah, it's a lot of trailblazing. What was that like?
It was exciting. Death isn't always sexy. So, there was a little bit of that, trying to help people understand that we needed to talk about this. Very proud to work with the palliative care team in its entirety here, though. They in themselves had been trailblazers. So it was really exciting to be part of a team of people. Had the mentorship and support of a palliative care social worker here in the area, which was really exciting. Michelle and I worked closely, but also kind of really looking at where were the gaps. So from a community lens and from a systemic lens, it's really kind of analyzing like where are the gaps? Like if we have this for a medical team and we also don't want to medicalize death because it's supposed to be a social event. So working really hard around advocacy lens around kind of how do we promote death, dying, and grief, and where are some of the places that we're not being representative. So that was good. A couple of years trying to secure funding, all of those pieces of social work and working in not-for-profit sectors, which is a challenge. So was able to do that. And then eventually we started to develop a more clinical side of kind of, could we have social work out in community, meeting people where they're at in their homes? How do we help provide home-based deaths? And so we were doing some pretty exciting work. I remember doing an analysis at the time because we were trying to decide whether we would go with a freestanding hospice. And at that time, there were none in Nova Scotia. But we were also at a time the hospital was just being built and we were thinking about donor fatigue. So this was going to be the first time we actually had a palliative care unit. So we actually, and I was really proud that research actually got really lifted, that we were really trying to look at keeping this hospice base more community out instead of people coming in. So that was an interesting model to start at that time and to really look at what the needs of people are and how do we get resourced. So that was an interesting social work role for sure.
And were there other models in other places that you were drawing on? So were you looking to particular places or spaces where they were doing what you wanted to be doing?
We looked a lot to the Australian research and really looking at their death literacy and how they were starting to work in schools. So, I mean, because I had all the nonprofit experience, I was able to do like education in the school system, education with teachers. I was looking at, we went back into Nova to look at grief and develop programs. So we were really trying to kind of fan that out from a death literacy. How do we get the communities comfortable to talk about death? So that became some cutting edge work that we were really doing here, which I was really excited. And from that, I got to sit on a lot of national tables and started to look at what other people were doing across the country and started to do a lot of networking that way. So it was a very exciting time in my career to really look at this in a lens of also looking at like, I think we get into this thing thinking about grief counseling, but we also needed to look at kind of how do people show up in Sobeys. We did a food from the heart and we were doing promotions at the local Sobeys to talk about death, dying, and grief. So we were doing some pretty neat things at the time, which I was really proud to be part of that with volunteers and other colleagues.
Wow,
Yeah.
So then what happened? How long were you there?
Well, My love for the hospice work is kind of thread throughout. So, I do believe kind of starting things and getting that vision up and running. And then I started to branch off to do more of the clinical lead work. And we brought in another executive director so that we could further develop the clinical aspects and kind of look at that. How do we get groups going? How are we doing more intensive palliative care out in the communities? So as far as time frames, hospice and I just have this ongoing friendship.
So I think you brought up like something that's quite important, and I've heard other people talk about it, but you've articulated it very nicely. So you start out in a role of executive director, and you're kind of trailblazing. At what point do you know that maybe it's time for you to take a different kind of a role in the organization, or maybe leave the organization? And then how do you do that? Because a lot of people struggle with kind of the stepping aside or bringing in a new vision. It can be hard to let go of something if you've been the person who starts it.
It is hard, but it's also I think of phases of developing. And I think leadership is that you really have to look at your leadership skills and what you have to offer. But this is really about sharing power, right? So the financial pieces of this, I was like, oh boy, the clinical, we started to see a gap, and that's where I thought it was much easier to move into that side of it and bring somebody in who really loved doing fund development and philanthropy work, right?
Yes.
And some of it's about your strengths. So that was important to me. Now, letting go of those things are really hard when they're your passion as well. And things are going to morph, I guess, as they need to over time. So one of the things I remember going back to one of my faculty, though, I had a really hard conversation probably 2 to 3 years into my social work career. I felt maybe we weren't as prepared for the system-based advocacy we needed to do.
Okay.
I always went into it thinking we were all on the same page internally. And I think that was a really big, abrupt shift for me to understand that is not the case. We still are very much entrenched in some of the medical models of how we deliver care and support to people. And one of the things that I talked to my social work mentor at that time and said to her, I wasn't prepared. She was great. She said, part of you staying well and doing well as a leader is that you need to know when to change your jobs. So you can stay very committed to causes and things that are important to you, but sometimes you are going to have to change jobs. And that conversation was very helpful for me to understand and to be more self-aware of when I needed to pivot and change in my career. And I have. And it has afforded me a very interesting look at the world and systems in a way that I don't think I would have if I had stayed on one path and never left that job. Now, for some people that works really well, and that's great. For me, I kept looking at, trying to help answer the questions that I have about the way our systems work and kind of where does social work even need to grow to flourish, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. So were there conclusions that you drew from that? Where particular areas, where does social work need to grow based on what you learned in that context? And where did the organization need to grow?
So
this is an example.
Yeah, there's organizations. So, I left the hospice world, which was really hard for me, and I went into education. And I thought there's something here I need to learn. All the while, I thought I was changing everything up, but I really wasn't, because I was bringing this skill set with me wherever I went. So when I went into the school system to work, what happened was I started to get referrals for all of the kids that there had been a death or there's some, major grief. So when I stopped and I thought, oh boy, what a mosaic my career has been. And I think I initially looked at that as a weakness, but then now I, over time, have really recognized this is part of a strength that I have, that I now have a lens to be able to look at different organizations, which has helped me when I've gone on to do consulting roles to help organizations understand, are we trauma informed? here's some spots that I see that we're really like, how we set up space, how we interact with people, how much are we caring for teams behind the scenes, what's happening with some of that vicarious work that we're carrying. So I think that mosaic actually has been a very incredible piece of where I have been able to go in my career. And I'm really grateful for that now, to understand that I think that needed to happen. So I needed to work with different age ranges and not just stay in one. It was great to be able to work with federal government, provincial government roles, the nonprofit sector, and where do they interface? And, we complain. I mean, we are really great to constantly talk about the siloing, but I actually don't see us really moving to a place that we're trying to break that down. So that's been a really interesting observation, to stand in all different levels of this and say, okay, wait a minute, who's missing at these tables? And how might we start to kind of work? And over my career, so after the school system, I've been doing some teaching at different colleges. So I had some great opportunities with that. I went on to do my master's degree, and I actually was able to do work with the Department of Labor and Advanced Education, started to develop curriculum that starts to kind of encompass more of a person, family, community-centered focus rather than kind of medical models to how we deal with what does that look like. So it was really interesting, and bringing those themes in of all of the different workplaces that I have been in, it really helped to kind of enhance whoever the audience was, that we could actually start to talk about those things. So I use an example of when we started working with some of people in care, for instance, in the province, and we talk about aging in place and how important that is, but we weren't talking about dying in place, and how incredibly important that is to the lifespan and the ending of a person's life, and for the staff, that we're not shifting people out or sending them out to somebody, but how do we actually help support that part of the life cycle, and what skills and supports do the staff need. So those kinds of things became really exciting. And then when I went back to do my master's, I was able to kind of take this social work, which I love about social work. You can do micro level work, you get to do that meso piece with teams and organizations, and then you also have this opportunity to look at policies. So I really love that in my career I've been able to kind of vacillate with those, and that's, I think, the most exciting part of being a social worker for me. But then when you lead into doing crisis work, so over the years and the different roles that I've had, and then looking at kind of the impacts of the mass casualty, really has alerted me to ways that I think social work has a voice. There's a strong need in this crisis-based work. Climate-based crises, violent-based crises. I think there's a place we could be standing stronger in this as an not an organization, but as a profession. So that's been an interesting kind of deconstruction of what all of these different layers of government, micro, meso, macro, what are we doing here? So it's been a really interesting time for me to really do a lot more soul searching about, what I see for social work in myself, the world around me, and possibly where we could go.
Okay. So maybe I'll just rewind a little bit. So you mentioned doing your MSW. Where did you do your or you mentioned doing your master's, so I'm assuming it's an MSW, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yes.
Where did you do your MSW?
At Memorial.
Okay.
Yep. So Newfoundland. So I kept the Atlantic, the maritime connection here. Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about that program and your experience when you were there?
So that program was very much online based with, I think I did 3 visits to the site to do week-long courses. I again stumbled across the most perfect mentor to help kind of expand faculty that had a passion for end of life. But again, one of the things that I recognized is that we have done maybe a better job in palliative care, but I do think that there's this other part that we are not doing. So I actually started to have a bit of an existential examination of how we look at death and dying only through a palliative care lens. when we're having such incredible amounts of suicide and drug-related deaths, and then violence is becoming part of our narrative in Canada, always has been. But like, where do those people go? And so it's been a shift, but Memorial offered me opportunity to do a lot of this independent work to bring the education that I was doing in to really look at how do we establish and look at content, curriculum, how do we measure and take a look at kind of what the effects of this are, how do we share power in this, that there's multiple truths and people's lives and people's dying. You know, we have to be much more expansive, so a lot more diverse lens of that. So that was helpful. Yeah, I mean, I think I missed more doing the in-class. Yeah.
The relationships that you make, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure you made relationships online, but it's a little bit different.
It is different. Yeah.
And did you do a placement while you were there?
I did, in policy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then what happened?
So then I just continued on doing the work I was doing. I took, again, another term to work with our health system to develop a grief and bereavement strategy and role. And so that all got started after my MSW. So that was exciting until we bumped into a pandemic and then, you know, a mass casualty on top of it. So that again, you know, I don't know. It's been a very interesting road.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Not everybody knows about this community, and folks will be watching this perhaps in the future and also from other places, other provinces. So, I mean, I think I lived here for a little bit of time, and I think there's some interesting things or unique things about sort of the Colchester region, right? There was the Westray incident, so there's already sort of some grief that was at the community level. It's a big weather place. So there's been lots of natural disaster and displacement that has happened to people. And then we had the mass casualty incident. So maybe you could just give a little bit of context, or maybe I already have, about sort of like what is the reality for folks who are living in this area?
Well, so context-wise, I see from a social work lens how we have to be really careful about being urban-centric. And I know from national tables that I've sat at, you know, really looking at that rural context, you know, we've got this Canadian landscape that's broad and vast and has all kinds of things we need to consider, but I don't know that we truly understand that context of rural practice and how isolating that can be, how resourceful we need to be, how challenging that can be for voice and knowledge. So I do think that we've got a great theoretical context that, you know, we don't do for, we do with. But when you try to apply that, so when you ask me about context about Colchester County, and again, the mass casualty happened, there's a few things that I think were very powerful about that whole experience that we need to learn from. And you know, we went through a mass casualty during a global pandemic. So all of the natural things we would do as a social worker were all impeded because we were supposed to be physically distancing. So you take communities that were already isolated, you add that isolation, and then you add the component of fear. That made for some challenges. One of the biggest things when I'm asked to speak nationally about all of this now, and one of the things that have been very important to me, is really advocating to other places. And I was just out speaking at a disaster management conference, and I said, when things happen in your community, it's so easy to pick up the hashtags and that communication. So what we started to hear immediately was this Nova Scotia Strong. When I went back to the literature reviews that happened during Swiss Air, which was another catastrophic moment in our history, We really looked at strength is actually one of those things we need to be really careful of, because it really indicates stoicism. And so you take rural communities that sometimes have some tensions around trusting some of our systems, and then you collide it with a crisis. You've got some challenges that you really need to be paying attention. I mean, were we openly talking about intimate partner violence? Were we talking about domestic violence? And when you're in rural communities, I think it has a bit of a different context to it when everybody knows people. Mm-hmm. So I think there's layers of this from evidence that we really need to elevate. For me, I feel like we get caught in a reactive cycle. So we started kind of asking people to go to mental health, but people weren't really seeing themselves as having a mental health issue. They were just really dysregulated, traumatized. And so I think there's a room for us to be much more proactive in our approaches. So I often think trauma doesn't have to become PTSD if we work from a preventative, proactive place, which really has been the essence of my work. I don't look at grief as this passive. It's a very active, how do we engage in people to talk about grief? Because what we've done is we've shoved it under the mental health bracket. And I don't think it belongs there. And so I think it's really confused people. So when you're actually talking about trailblazing, I feel like we're back into that place again to say, what is grief? Where does it belong? How do we start to work proactively? And so when I look at Nova Scotia and I look at the natural disasters, the sea-based disasters we've had, right, that's part of living on the coast, is that we've been exposed to these kinds of tragedies. Do we actually have good response plans, or do we have reactive plans? And so stabilizing a community in 24 to 48 hours is not the work that happens after the, what I often say is when the casseroles stop coming, then what happens? And that to me is the intentional work. Ironically, we're here on April 15th. We've got our 5th year anniversary coming up on the weekend. I have so many people reaching out saying, I'm not doing well and I'm not understanding. So that education around trauma, we know about adverse childhood experiences, but what are we doing from a community-based, from a policy-based lens to change that trajectory? When these big things have been happening on top of their own micro level things that might be happening in their homes, we have an opportunity to start shifting that. And I think to me, that's really a critical piece of this. So when I have gone and I've attended conferences in New York with people who have done crisis-based work all over the world, to me, this is a place in Canada that we really need to be rising up from. Like, we really need to look at crisis-based work. And I don't mean at a micro level. I mean, when macro events happen, how do we help communities find power, find their voices, find their ability to start that healing process?
So what does the alternative look like? I mean, I think of, like, I worked for a brief period of time in EAP, where we would sometimes do debriefing in work sites, for example, where there had been an incident. And we were taught on the old Mitchell model where you do the debriefing, but that's been proven not to be proven. And I interviewed a counselor or a social worker in Peterborough, Ontario, who had a long history of EAP work, and he was saying that when 9/11 happened, they put them on a bus, sent everybody down to Manhattan, and they were doing groups for people, and you could see out the window the buildings were still burning, and everyone ended up more traumatized and quite unwell physically from the exposure. So that doesn't seem like the right thing, that doesn't work. So what is the better way?
I think that in our work, and this is an interesting place that I observe, and again, this is just an observation from my perspective as a social work leader. We have had to kind of grow as a profession. And I think we're oftentimes trying to really elevate what we do in a way that I often wonder if we're somehow maybe losing some of the essence of what we also do. So there becomes a hierarchy in social work. I watch it in other professions, right? Like, do I call myself a clinical social worker? Do I call myself a community social worker? And does that mean two different things? I often say to people, I think we need to be careful of that stuff, right? Like creating those hierarchies. And I'm not sure that we really have grasped what the diverse leadership pieces of being a social worker. I still think our identity is still blurry. I guess I want to say that. And I think when you ask about things like that, I remember going out in one of the affected communities to do some work with one of the fire brigades. So we think about all these volunteers that are affected. And I remember meeting the fire chief at the door, and the fire chief with like hands on hips saying, "What are you coming in here to do?" And I said, "You know what? I absolutely love that you have this passion, you're this protective, and you have these questions." And he talked about the impacts of having people come in to do debriefings that actually cause more harm to the people on his team. And so I look at one of the things that has been really emergent in my career is how much I really love doing group work. But I needed to go to an organization in the United States to really enhance my skills. So I think a lot of people get pulled out of roles and are expected to go do things that are probably out of their wheelhouse, right? And I often think that this is on us to be really thinking about, do I have the skill sets? Do I have the scope? Because that, I think, is still, we're very much caught in a reactive cycle. And I don't think that stuff is helpful on the long haul. It might offer something in the immediate, but what is it we're trying to do? Because when people are in a heightened, dysregulated state, what is our goal? You know, where are the resources for the 5-year anniversary? Because the thaw is only starting to come off now for some people. Some people are telling me this is getting worse. And when I look at evidence, of course it is. You know, we've tracked other mass casualty events, and it's got long tentacles. I wrote a little article for our local social work. I mean, and we talk about an earthquake, and then we talk about the aftershocks, but we sensationalize the earthquake. We don't really talk about what that psych safety stuff really looks like on the long haul. And how do we help people on their time frames, not ours? And I see the system as very much about what we need to do. So I do think that there's room for social work to expand that. When we look at the harm that's been caused, we have to acknowledge that. I mean, we also look at two-eyed seeing the harm that we have to be able to embrace the culture, big C culture and small c culture of communities, of organizations, and whatever expertise we think we have. And I remember, this was a little bit of a funny piece of my history. When I moved from New Brunswick and came to Nova Scotia, I went through the candidacy period, and I ended up having to do a case study to put before the college. So I, put my case study together. I did all of this analysis, and it was great. It was fun. And then I had to go down and present it. And I remember asking, do you have any questions? And they were like, no, actually, this was really thorough. And I said, well, we better come up with some questions because this was a lot of work. And I thought it was interesting because one of them said to me, will you go on and do a PhD in grief? And they said, we really see the work you're doing and that we need more. And because I said, why would I do that? And they said, because we need more experts in grief. And I remember challenging that right in that moment to say, the day that I become an expert in anybody's grief is the day that I really should get out of this work. And so I struggled, but I didn't realize at the time I was struggling with power. And so I think that this is an important piece as a social work leaders about where do we share power? How do we put that back to community to tell us what they need? How do we not go in with our little briefcases of saying this is the way the group's going to go, even though we know that people are potentially getting harmed with vicarious trauma? So I think that there's this piece that I would love to see us evolve. I see some, again, I see some really incredible organizations south of the border and globally. Went to Germany to do some presentation, and I snuck into a European social work. And there was a group of people, I believe they were from Denmark, talking about that they have free counseling for every child 0 to 16 that experiences a death. It is available for everybody. It's free, it's accessible for any child. And I was like, wow. So any child that has a death in their family, in their life, has access to this. Those are the kinds of things that I wish we could start to see that growth potential here. Accessibility, and I think that's the challenge of working across this vast country with all of these needs, but I do think there needs to be some understanding of how are we being proactive.
Where to go now?
Is this feeling like I feel like I'm
I think it's all really important. I just maybe want to go back, and maybe we'll edit it a little bit, but like I feel like we got into the deep stuff without maybe finishing the like what happened next.
Okay.
about so you left the role of ED at the hospice. You took on the education role, then you moved on to the next job that you had. So what was the transition from hospice to, what happened after hospice? What happened next?
So after I left that hospice role, that's when I went into education and worked with schools.
Okay.
And again, that was developmental because we were just starting Schools Plus. That was a new initiative in the province.
Okay.
So I was the first social worker to be hired as a Schools Plus facilitator. Okay. So kids ages primary rate up to grade 12, kind of pyramid structure. It was the top 5% of kids. But that ended up being thousands of kids.
Right.
And again, I mean, these initiatives I think are important. Mm-hmm. These initiatives are really under-resourced. At the beginning it was. Now they have seen expansion, great expansion from that program. So that was the transition I went in to do, the kind of developmental, get that off the ground, start to build the relationships. And I think I stayed in that job for 2 to 3 years. And I started to get pretty exhausted. So I took probably a 6-month break. Did some soul searching, and I still did a bit of work with hospice, like they would call for contract work and things like that. And I think it was at that time that I started to pivot my career more into education, not the system education, but providing education.
Community education.
Yeah. Okay. So that change happened, and I have found that very fulfilling to be part of the education parts of that work. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess if you look back, the changes that I made were often being invited into places that were brand new, starting new programs. That seems to be the theme of my career. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it feels like it's okay for you, like in terms of the way you're talking about it. For some people, they want to find a place, stay there, and be there. But it sounds like your personality or your approach allows you to move on.
Yeah, the diversity has been important to me. But I find that over time, I mean, what I did was ended up circling back to all those organizations to work with them. It just changed. So I think about all the nonprofits. I think about Schools Plus. In my grief job back with Nova Scotia Health, I actually was able to come back and start to do work with the Schools Plus facilitators to how do we actually embed this literacy more into the schools. So it's like I might have left the job, but I also have an identity, I think, that has been passionate about this work that threads it all back to all of the jobs that I've done before. So in some ways, I don't know that I really ever left. It just is a very intricate dance that I've been able to do.
You mentioned about the importance of learning, developing skills, and then your need to kind of travel to find what you're looking for. Could you say a little bit about the kinds of training that you've done and the places that you've visited doing that training in order to kind of, I'll describe it as upskill yourself so that you're enhancing your capacity to do the things you want to do.
And medical assistance in dying came into play, the policies around that changed the whole trajectory around how do we deal with dying. And does palliative care deal with that, or who deals with that? So that became an interesting time in my history of doing my work, sitting on panels, talking about all of this, really looking at this through a diversity lens around kind of who's being excluded, who's being included. Is this accessible? I spoke at conferences all across Canada, in the United States. But in that, I was always seeking more information from those, where else is research being done? I remember some of the researchers and academic folks there became pivotal in being able to handle the mass casualty because I had direct connections now with people. I went to the Dougie Center in Portland, Oregon, and spent a summer doing their international coursework. I mean, I loved group work. I thought I was pretty good at group work, but when I went there, I got better at doing group work. And I don't find that we have readily. And so during the mass casualty, I actually advocated really hard that we needed a center here that was both for support and education, because Canada kind of needs that. I have had so many colleagues now trying to fly to Portland, Oregon, trying to afford this, trying to get they need this stuff here, right? So that's part of what I see is kind of how do we upskill and understand that I often say there's a map and a territory. And I think we often get the map first without exploring the territory. And to me, our territory is changing, and it's changing all the time. And so that's where I believe as leaders, for social work leaders, we need to be able to assess territories with people. And then we have to create maps. And I feel like they're often in reverse from a systems lens. Here, go do EFAP. Here, go do a debriefing. Well, no, that's not what's needed. So I think the more that we're able to get out and do that education, but I also think that there comes a time that we have to be able to promote that internally within our provinces and our country. What are some of those skills that are going to help take us through some of where our changes are happening so that this is in real time? Does that answer that question? Better?
Answer that question, yes. Thank you very much.
Trying to think like when I went to an end-of-life conference in Germany. So many connections and so much expansion of knowledge. When I went to New York for the 9/11, Mary Fetchett is a social worker whose son died during 9/11. She's gone on to create the Voices Center for Resilience, and she's promoted and put her whole passion into developing this. And every year on the anniversary has a conference that she opens globally. So she and I were on the Mass Casualty Commission for the panel, for the expert panel. And I had all of these amazing people globally who were standing beside me trying to say, this is what you need here. So then I was invited to go down to New York, and we were able to spend time. And I was like, this crisis work has really taken off in all of these countries. And I feel maybe we have some catching up to do here. But those were powerful conversations and groups and things that I attended in that. I'm constantly tracking literature and again, not just literature, but people. Who can I consult with? There also has to be an openness to take evidence to a different layer. And this is not all you're not doing well. It's about how do we, again, look at lifting communities with communities instead of kind of making this a micro level issue. That's where my passion really is about policy and how do we change this and look at something that's more inclusive. Or to pick, what do you know about what these communities need? So those are challenges, and those are systemic issues that I still find we're bumping into constantly. We did a session, you mentioned Westray. I mean, I was doing a session in that community, and it happened to be on the anniversary, and I started the whole session with an acknowledgement of the grief that we may be feeling on this day. people at the end of it, that was the most powerful part for them, that you acknowledge what we've been through. And people need to be seen, and they need to be heard, and they need to be valued for the experiences they've had. When I'm working with First Nations communities, I used to be criticized all the time in the prison because when I went in, I would often acknowledge and apologize. My profession has done historical damage to your communities, to your peoples. I acknowledge that. We're establishing social legacy. And to me, at the end of my career, I want to know that I have at least contributed in some way to some change that feels that it's going to try to help leave this world a teeny bit better than, and I don't know. I mean, I look at after the Turning the Tides report came out for the mass casualty, one of the social policy people that I worked with through the process said, you know, you have changed language. We won't talk about mental health in upcoming reports. We'll talk about grief and trauma. And that's change. Didn't feel like enough to me, but I guess language and acknowledgement is an important piece.
So what's happened since the mass casualty inquiry and the work that you were doing on that? Are you still continuing that kind of work? Have you moved into other areas?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think this has probably been one of the hardest parts of my career. And people say, you know, you may be acknowledged and valued for your work in other parts of the country, the province, wherever, but when you're at home. So it's been really hard holding evidence and knowledge and understanding of the way other people have looked at crisis, how we could advance, and not always feeling like I have a voice at the table. Yeah. So that's been incredibly challenging. I think one of the hard things about trying to stand, and I remember, you know, faculty talking about structural social work. And do you ever notice, if we went back to junior high and you were a person who would stand up to be able to say, I don't believe that this is a just way to do this, and everybody would stay silent around you, but when you went to the bathroom, they would all flock around you and it's like, oh my God, thank you. That to me is probably the hardest part of this, is that I wish we as social workers had a bit more of having each other's backs. I find a lot of people, like when I've done mentorship for other social workers, the isolative factor I think is really harmful. I think you see people that come out of school with these values and passion, but you know, their voice doesn't often get at the table in a way that I think they can. You know, I've often said, even within our healthcare structures, I find that it's so outdated that, you know, we still have the same amount of social work allocation of funds that we had probably 40 years ago. So I don't know that I guess I've just worked in a lot of different organizations, and I would say the common theme is that I have found this work to be quite isolating. And I think that takes a toll. Yeah. So there's one thing about really trying to focus on social justice values and really, and I know there's great privilege that comes with our voice, and we have to be very aware of that and how we use it, but sometimes it's a little bit like singing in the wind. So that's not been an easy part of the career, my career.
Yeah, I think that metaphor of the folks flocking around you when you step away from the table after you've said something that's challenging or hard. Is that, that's the junior high version, but like maybe the adult social work version is there are folks who are like, I'm so glad you said that, it's really important, but I'm a careerist and I'm not going to piss off the people who may advance my career. So I'll find it well for you to do it, and I agree with you, but I'm not going to do it. And so finding how do we do solidarity in a better way, maybe is, and how do you, I don't know, the careerist piece is challenging for sure.
It's huge.
Yeah.
And while I can respect, I mean, I get it. I mean, I've been a single mother the entire time I've had my social work career. But I don't think I've ever been a careerist. And I understand that we all have our ways, but I just wish there were more solidarity in this. And I think we have to be very conscientious of the hierarchy that we're unintentionally creating in this profession, because we all have incredible value, regardless. And so that to me becomes a bit distressing about how, for the people who do speak up, I just always challenge that whole, like, let's talk about it in the bathroom, or these secret kind of like, oh, good thing you did this. And I think that's been a little bit of the consequence of this public part of going through a crisis, is that you kind of get drawn into bringing these skills. And I remember when the mass casualty first occurred and we were already swimming with a lot of potential for death, dying, and grief from a pandemic. So there was a lot of things happening all at once. And I remember like my manager at that time saying, like, you don't have to do this. And I'm like, no, I don't feel like I have to do this. But I said, it's like somebody who trains to be a soldier and then there's a war and you're like, no, I don't want anything to do with it. I feel like this is my career, like, so I can't turn away from it now. I feel like I have something to offer here. May not be grand, but it's something. And yeah. And again, I think whether we work for mental health, whether whoever we work for, I wish there were more solidarity underneath of it about kind of how we're all kind of contributing to healthy communities and healthy pathways, and really looking at, again, let's not focus so much on the map, but what is the territory? Like, where are we now? Because it's different than we were 2 years ago, and it will be different again in another 3 years. And I think we have to kind of be moving more fluidly with that. Somebody used an analogy with me that I thought was very interesting, and they said, it's like you're all on a cruise ship and everybody's having, lots to eat, they're doing their thing. And then for some reason, if you have to step away to get on the lifeboat for a bit, and then all of a sudden you're watching the cruise ship pull away, and you're not on it. And just what that feeling is of seeing it leave, and you're kind of like, what do I do? Do I go get back on it, even though I know that this is not, it's potentially harmful, it's whatever. And I really appreciate it because this person said, like, it's scary being in that boat by yourself. But they said, sometimes when you sit still for a bit, you get to see the stars again. And that helps to bring the clarity about what it is which direction do you want to go in. And so those things are important to me to really, like, at the end of the day, I've often said to students that I may be mentoring, like, you have yourself to look in the mirror. You have your values, whatever the things that you're feeling aligned to that are important in the work you do. And those are going to be those hard calls that you're going to have to make. And they're not easy. But it's also been a bit of a guiding principle for me about when I feel the values have become very misaligned in systems, then that's where I step back to say, okay, I may need something different here.
Might come under the category of what we used to describe as working from the inside or working from the outside. And they're both important and valid.
Right.
And sometimes you can do one for a while, and then you have to do the other for a while.
Right.
I think.
Yep. Absolutely. So this interview may not look the same as a lot that I've got on one job and went till I was done. I feel like the changes have been probably helpful for me. And it has given me a different lens to look at it. I don't know, I'm not saying it's better than or worse, it's just a different lens.
Yeah, absolutely. So, future plans? Do you have a sense of where you're going next or what you're doing next? I know you're pausing, but just if you have some goals or...
I think probably there needs to be a component of writing. And I do think that that's going to be an important piece. So I've been really thinking about that. Like when you've gathered this evidence, you've walked a very intricate path. What do you do with all of that? So I've been really thinking about that lately. Like, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And just been jotting things, writing. So I don't know. I don't know if that will become a path. I've thought about PhD. Yeah.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, exciting. You mentioned a few mentors along the way. Are there other mentors that you might like to mention who helped you?
That's the one thing that I often say when we're doing candidacy work is that I always, no matter what role I'm in, no matter what phase in life I'm in, I'm always looking for mentors. So there's been a lot of mentors along the way, and there will continue to be, I hope, because I think that that's been a very vital part of my work, is really looking at who are some of the knowledge keepers, but sometimes not even the people that you expect. So yeah, I mean, we talked about Brian Willett. He was a fantastic mentor. I think about Donna Willard, who worked with me at the United Way, who saw, that fire, right? That Michelle Rigby, she's been fantastic. I think about Stephen Jenkinson, who was doing some really cutting edge looking at death and dying in a way that maybe we weren't really prepared. So that has really helped me to have a different foundation under me around looking at death and dying and really looking at it through a critical analysis. Like, what are we doing with that? I think about Patty McEwen, who was a manager I had, who also had a social work background and really taught me a lot about being people-centered and that being part of a role of a leader. You have knowledge, but you're also, how do you raise the power, share the power in your team? So Patty would definitely be somebody that I would consider. Who else have been, boy, there's a lot. I should have jotted that one down. I'm going to feel really bad for not thinking of all of the other people. Oh, Senator Wanda Thomas Bernard. I was very passionate about some things that were happening in our community, so that helped me to join the Advisory Council, the Status of Women, and trying to kind of think about and move forward with issues around gender, race. Michelle Peters, a colleague I've met along the way who is completing her PhD and bringing a very strong Indigenous focus to two-eyed seeing, our trauma and grief. What does that look like? So I really have loved working with her. Philippa Pictou, again, another person who has been a real, gentle warrior to help move things. Then I think about, internationally, some of the people that I followed in research and people like Mary Fetchett, again, from really looking at how she's taken her social work role in New York after a crisis and really done something pretty powerful with it. And that's had tentacles across the whole world. Jana at the Dougie Center, who was fantastic to be on the phone with me when I was mapping out kind of plans for post-mass casualty. What do you do in the States? We're not riding in trying to save people, but how do we work with people? So she's been pretty fantastic too. She does a great podcast. There's been a lot of people. Yeah.
Will you please give some advice to young social workers who are starting their career, who are thinking about wanting to be change makers and innovators and trailblazers and leaders? What would you say to them?
I think about something that one of my faculty at Memorial questioned me on, which has been pivotal. I think we all come with history. We all come with a reason why we wanted to get into social work.
No, I
Yeah.
worked with Dolores, yes, and we interviewed her.
Sorry. Excellent. Again, another mentor. And I always remember the day Dolores called me and said, we had a talk, and she's like, I feel like you're scared of power. And I got really uncomfortable because I didn't know how to answer it. And I often think about her guidance in that pivotal moment for me. It's like, what do we do with power? When we have it, we don't have it. How do we take little parts and try to use it to an advantage as far as kind of elevating how do we get other voices at the table? So I often say, for new social workers to think about, what is your relationship to power? How do you see yourself sharing that? And that was a very pivotal moment around thinking about that because, it helps to keep me in check about what am I doing with this? Do I have any power, and how am I? So I think about all of the causes that may be really important to us, people who aren't at the table. I know when I'm working now, I have often asked people, if you feel like you may have a dominant voice at the table, how do you step back? So it's also teaching other people that, we have to start changing the landscape of how we're including and not including people. So that's a big thing. As a social work candidate I was talking to not that long ago, it's really thinking about how do you feel ready? How are you, again, supporting? Where do you get collective help and support rather than this self-care stuff? I don't know what to do with that stuff anymore because I feel like it further isolates us to go off in the corner. And do you set up your own kind of circles? How do we keep elevating that? What is it that you feel you need? What are you missing? And so really trying to, I guess, if I were to come back to a candidate, I would work with their map and territory. Where do you see? Where are some of these strengths? What do you see as potential challenges that you're going to have? And how do you find that flow? And who do you gather around yourself so that you're breaking down some of the isolative pieces of being a social worker, sometimes in a role that you're the only one? So those to me would be really important things to be able to support new people coming into the profession. So you came here for a reason. How do we keep that kind of eagerness? I don't know, passion's an interesting word. But the things that have been important that led you to this. So I think it's, again, how do you surround yourself? Those would be important things that I would be talking to new social workers about. Yep.
So I think I understand the metaphor of territory and map, but I'm wondering if you'll just tell us how you understand map and territory, because it's a metaphor you've used a few times.
So I often think about when you're flying, and you remember when you used to have the flight pattern on the back of the seat ahead of you? I often think it's interesting when you take off and you're following that, and you're it makes it look so easy. But if I were to get off this plane and try to walk that same terrain, I'm going to have to deal with a whole lot of things. And that's sometimes where I see the conflict, is that the maps that we're using are not, when you're out in the terrain, it's a lot different than we may have prepared you for. So I think that I'm always, when I do organizational work, it's you may have a map. That map might have really served you well 5 years ago, but what's the terrain looking like now? How are we doing? What's sick leaves looking like? Is there enthusiasm about coming to work? Are we person-centered? Are we losing that? So I think we have to have honest dialogue. We have to be able to lean in to talk about kind of where are some of the issues that we're seeing. And I think I apply that to my personal life. What is my terrain right now? And where do I need to pivot my own map? What am I missing? Because that terrain might be really deep, and at parts of my career it has been. And I've needed different things. I've needed different people. I've needed different jobs. And that just becomes, so that's the metaphor that I've been using. And I don't know, does that clarify it a little bit more?
Very much, but I didn't want to make an assumption.
Yeah.
All right. So before we wrap up, are there any other stories, any other anecdotes you want to share before we conclude?
So I do think we have some identity work to still do in this country, about what we do and all the diverse ways we show up. And some of the campaigns I do see that we're making some changes, which is good. But how does that translate to different types of workplaces?
Well, thank you so much for giving us your time, for sharing your story. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.